Welcome in, everybody, ready to dive deep. We're taking a close look at Bob Woodward's War today, this book that, pulls back the curtain on some pretty wild global politics, right?
Yeah, Woodward's got this knack for getting people to, spill the beans, people at the top. So it's like we're right there in the room for these, high-stakes conversations and strategy sessions. You get a feel for the personalities and the pressures.
And we're going to get into all of it. Excerpts from Trump's years, Biden handling some major global stuff, and even a glimpse into Zelensky's world, right? With Ukraine facing, superpower.
It's crazy how Woodward connects all these events that seem totally separate at first, but they all kind of feed into this global landscape that's constantly changing. Decisions in one place, boom, ripple effects across the planet.
Like a global game of cause and effect, which is why this is so relevant for you. By understanding how power works, how these leaders chose, well, we get insights into how the world works. Makes sense, right?
Totally. And a good place to start, I think, is Trump. Woodward met him way back, even before he was president. And those early encounters, they show some pretty interesting personality traits.
Okay, so let's go back in time. Back to, 1989, long before the Oval Office. What did Woodward pick up on?
Well, he saw this intense focus on winning, no matter what, even back then. Trump was kind of a master at manipulating situations, always working the angles, and just relentless. It's like these traits were, hints of how he'd approach the presidency later on.
That story about the building inspectors really sticks out. Woodward said Trump basically told him from day one, screw them, straight up refusing to pay fines and dragging things out until the inspectors just gave up.
Really shows his mindset, right? Rules were just things to get around. You got to bully your opponents into submission. And that, as we'll see, became a big part of his presidency.
And speaking of which, war takes us right into the thick of it on January 6th, the Capitol riot. Those frantic calls between Trump and McCarthy. Man, Woodward really captures the chaos.
It's intense. You have McCarthy practically begging Trump to call off the rioters, to step in and restore order. But Trump, it's almost like he's hesitant, not really wanting to take action.
Chilling, for sure. And there's this detail about the Trump family up on Air Force One during all this. They were completely separate, at the front of the plane, totally removed from what was happening. One aide even said they never came back.
Gives you this image of, detachment. It's almost like they were just watching a crisis unfold, not, the people responsible for dealing with it.
Then, just days later, McCarthy visits Trump at Mar-a-Lago. Woodward says Trump was, quote, moping, but also already super focused on the idea that the election was stolen, a focus that just, got stronger in the following months.
It's a turning point, right? You see Trump refusing to accept the loss, and that sets the stage for him trying so hard to overturn the results.
Woodward lays it all out there. Those claims of election fraud and Trump pushing to be reinstated, all presented factually. It's up to the reader to draw their own conclusions.
Exactly. He's committed to objective reporting, no opinions added, just the events, Lets us grapple with what it all means.
So from Trump's wild exit, we shift to Biden entering the scene. And, man, their approaches are so different, especially when it comes to, relying on experts.
Yeah, total style change. Woodward talks about Biden consulting Fiona Hill, she's a top Russia expert, before meeting Putin for the first time. He genuinely wanted to understand Putin, to get a handle on how complex that relationship is.
It shows a whole different approach to foreign policy. Expertise matters to Biden. He carefully thinks things through. A big contrast to, Trump's more impulsive, from the gut decision-making.
A key takeaway for sure. These different ways of leading, gathering info, weighing options, it all had big consequences as things unfolded globally.
Speaking of consequences, the Afghanistan withdrawal was a rough one for Biden. A lot of criticism came from that.
War helps us understand that withdrawal, though. Woodward explains how Biden has always believed the U.S. was overextended in Afghanistan, what he called mission creep. He even fought with Obama about it back when he was VP.
So it wasn't just a sudden decision. These were deeply held beliefs based on his analysis of the situation.
Exactly. But even with good intentions, man, the execution was messy. Woodward doesn't shy away from the critiques of Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and how the administration handled it all.
Even the best plans can go wrong when you're dealing with reality on the ground, it seems.
That's the thing with these complex situations, right? So many moving parts, unexpected problems popping up, and unintended consequences.
Okay, let's shift focus to another major challenge for Biden.
Right.
His relationship with Putin, especially with all the Ukraine stuff going on. What does Woodward tell us about this dynamic?
Well, one thing that stands out is how much detail Woodward gives about the intelligence leading up to the invasion. It was clear Putin was planning something big, but there was debate within the Biden administration about, like, what his ultimate goals were.
So they knew something was coming. But the full scope of Putin's ambitions, that was still unclear. Talk about pressure. How did Biden approach this, given his history with Putin?
Woodward describes this chilling moment from a 2011 meeting. Biden looking right into Putin's eyes, and he said he saw no soul, a detail that, speaks volumes about how complicated their relationship is.
So Biden had a sense of Putin's character pretty early on. Did that influence how he viewed the intelligence they were getting?
Hard to say for sure, but it definitely provides context for their relationship, the psychological side of things. And it's a stark contrast to how Trump seemed to have this warmer relationship with Putin, especially during that Helsinki summit.
You're talking about when Trump basically sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence on Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Yeah, exactly. That moment shocked a lot of people, right? And it really highlighted the huge difference between how Trump and Biden approach leadership on the global stage.
Two completely different personalities, two totally different approaches to the same adversary.
Wow.
Okay, so we've set the stage. A new president facing a growing threat from an old foe. Now, to understand the Ukraine war, we have to understand Zelensky, this unexpected wartime leader who came from, of all things, comedy.
Yeah, Zelensky's journey from comedian to wartime president is amazing. Woodward highlights his fierce determination to defend Ukraine even against impossible odds. There's this powerful moment in his inauguration speech where he talks about being ready to pay any price to stop Ukrainian heroes from dying.
Wow. Gives you chills. It shows his character and commitment to his country. How did that resolve manifest itself in the face of Russian aggression?
Well, Woodward takes us inside those tense months before the invasion. You see the back and forth between world leaders, the strategy of sharing intelligence to try to deter Putin, even a dramatic video call between Biden and Putin, like a high-stakes chess match with Ukraine's fate hanging in the balance.
Sounds incredibly tense. Anything in particular stick out to you from that time?
One wild anecdote is about the head of German intelligence. He was totally caught off guard by the invasion and had to be evacuated from Ukraine at the last minute.
No way. Even seasoned intelligence pros were shocked by how quickly and boldly Putin acted.
Really shows how fast things escalated and how even the best assessments can get overtaken by events.
As the world watched in disbelief, the invasion began. But, Woodward points out, the global landscape had already started shifting in response to Putin's aggression.
Absolutely. One of the biggest changes was that NATO got stronger. Countries that had hesitated to confront Russia before were now united against Putin's actions. A remarkable show of solidarity in the face of a common threat.
It seems like Putin's actions might have backfired, pushing those countries closer and making NATO more determined. What other ripple effects did the invasion trigger?
We saw a historic shift in European security. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral countries, decided to join NATO.
That's huge. What led to that decision?
It shows how deeply Russia's actions had shaken things up. These countries, comfortable with neutrality before, suddenly felt like they needed the collective security that NATO offered. It's a major turning point in European history, driven by fear of Russian expansionism.
So Putin trying to weaken an alliance might have actually made it stronger. Unintended consequences in action.
That's a key takeaway here. Actions have consequences, and sometimes those consequences are the opposite of what was intended.
But a stronger NATO also raises the stakes, right? Now there's an even bigger chance of a larger conflict.
That's the paradox of power. Strengthening alliances can deter aggression, but also make tensions worse.
And speaking of tensions, war gets into the very real fear of nuclear war during this time.
It was scary, for sure. Woodward shares this story where Biden, furious about Putin's recklessness, says, "I'm revoking his fucking license," shows just how concerned and frustrated the Biden administration was.
Whoa, that's a raw reaction. Makes it real,
Yeah.
Reminds you, these aren't just abstract geopolitical calculations. They're decisions with the potential for catastrophe. Did they do anything specific to address the nuclear threat?
There were serious worries that Putin might use a dirty bomb, a conventional bomb with radioactive material. Woodward details the efforts behind the scenes to stop Putin from taking that drastic step. Intense diplomacy and high-stakes brinkmanship.
So while everyone's focused on the war in Ukraine, there's this parallel effort to prevent a nuclear escalation. It's a reminder that there are often multiple crises going on at the same time, each with its own dangers.
That's global politics for you, a complex and often unpredictable game with incredibly high stakes.
As the world was trying to process this new reality, another crisis erupted,
Mm.
the Hamas attack on Israel. What does Woodward have to say about that conflict and how the Biden administration responded?
Woodward takes you right into the chaos and, the horror of those first attacks. You see the Biden administration scrambling, trying to figure out what's happening and how to stop things from getting worse.
I bet the pressure was intense. What do we learn about how they handled it all?
There's this crazy anecdote where Netanyahu is practically begging Jake Sullivan to threaten Hezbollah, the group in Lebanon backed by Iran. He's basically asking the U.S. to step in and stop the conflict from spreading.
Wow, that's a huge request. You can feel the desperation. What did Sullivan do?
It's a tense moment. Sullivan's caught between, helping a key ally and the risk of making the whole thing bigger. He ends up advising caution, telling Netanyahu to think about the consequences of dragging Hezbollah in.
Classic example of that balancing act the U.S. always has to do, right? Support an ally, but also prevent a huge regional war.
Yeah.
What was Biden's approach to all this?
Woodward shows Biden walking a really fine line. He wants to support Israel's right to defend itself, but also knows a wider war could break out. He's constantly on the phone with Netanyahu, with other world leaders trying to de-escalate things.
So public support and private pressure, kind of a two-pronged approach.
Exactly. And there's this really tense moment where Biden tells Netanyahu, straight up, you've got no strategy. You can tell he's frustrated with Netanyahu's approach, wants him to think more long-term about the consequences.
That's interesting, seeing how Biden handles pressure. Not afraid to challenge allies when he thinks they're being reckless. Did it work, though? Did Netanyahu listen?
Hard to say for sure, but Woodward does describe Biden personally warning Netanyahu not to attack Hezbollah first, making it clear the U.S. wouldn't be on board with that.
So Biden was setting boundaries, limiting Israel's actions while still backing them up. Did that create tension between the U.S. and Israel?
Definitely a sense of strain there, especially as the war in Gaza keeps going and the world starts criticizing Israel's actions more and more. Woodward captures that feeling of isolation, which just makes things harder for Biden.
So the Middle East is heating up, tensions with Russia are super high, and then, out of nowhere, there's an attempt to assassinate Donald Trump at a campaign rally.
It's chilling. It shows how divided the U.S. is politically and that violence is a real possibility. Adds a whole other layer of complexity to an already volatile situation globally.
Hard to imagine the impact of something like that. How did Trump react?
Woodward describes him as really shaken. It's like he's facing the real consequences of all the division he's created.
A sobering moment, to be sure. Did it change his approach at all, though?
Not really. Woodward shows Trump going right back to campaigning, attacking Biden even harder, and painting a really dark picture of America under Biden's leadership. Even facing death didn't change his ambition or soften his approach.
So political ambition wins out, even after something that traumatic. It speaks to the power of those political divides and how hard it is to govern effectively when that's happening.
Absolutely. And with the 2024 election coming up, the stakes are incredibly high. The whole world is watching, wondering what's next for the U.S. and its role globally.
Now, as war starts wrapping up, Woodward looks at the long-term impact of all these events. What does he have to say about how this period has reshaped the world?
One thing that jumps out is this growing sense of uncertainty and instability. The war in Ukraine drags on, Russia's isolated, and the threat of a wider conflict is still there.
That's a pretty bleak picture. Sounds like the world is entering a new era of, global competition and conflict. What about the Middle East? Did things calm down after the Hamas-Israel fighting?
Sadly, no. Woodward portrays the Middle East as this super volatile place. The ceasefire is shaky, and the root causes of the conflict are still there. It feels like it could explode again at any moment.
So we're left with these unresolved conflicts and simmering tensions. It's a reminder that these problems don't just disappear. They need constant attention, diplomacy, and a willingness to address what's causing them in the first place.
Absolutely. And looking ahead, Woodward asks some big questions about global leadership. What will the U.S.'s role be in a world with multiple power centers? Can democracies stand up to authoritarian regimes like Russia and China?
Huge questions. And even bigger now with Trump potentially back in the White House. How does Woodward deal with that possibility?
He shares some really insightful observations from people who worked closely with Trump during his presidency, people who saw how he makes decisions and can offer a unique perspective on his leadership style.
I bet those insights are fascinating, especially with a potential second Trump term on the horizon. What do these insiders have to say about how he leads?
One quote that really hits hard comes from General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump. He says, "No one has ever been as dangerous to this country as Donald Trump." That's a serious statement from someone who saw it all firsthand.
Wow, that's a heavy assessment. You can sense the concern about Trump's temperament and whether he's fit to be president. Are there any other examples of these insider perspectives?
Yeah, a lot of other former officials express similar worries about Trump being impulsive, ignoring norms, and putting his own interests ahead of the country's. They paint a picture of a leader who's unpredictable, maybe even dangerous.
It's unsettling hearing that from people who worked so closely with him. Does Woodward get into any specific policy areas where these concerns played out?
He does talk about how Trump handled the COVID-19 pandemic, which was widely criticized. Woodward points out that Trump didn't want to listen to experts, downplayed the virus, and focused more on his political image than public health.
It shows how important good leadership is during a crisis, and how the wrong approach can have terrible consequences. With the 2024 election getting closer, these insider perspectives become even more important.
For sure. They give us a peek into what a second Trump term could look like and the potential risks for the U.S. and the world.
It seems like Woodward, without saying it directly, is asking voters a crucial question. Are these the qualities we want in a leader, especially in such a complex and uncertain world?
That's the question every voter has to face when they go to the polls. And war helps us understand how important that decision is.
So we've explored the ups and downs of Trump's presidency, how Biden dealt with global crises, and the possibility of Trump coming back. What are some of the main themes that come out of this deep dive into war?
It's like we've been through this whirlwind, right? Global power struggles, decisions with huge consequences. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, definitely. So what are the big takeaways for you? What really stands out?
The thing that hits me hardest is leadership under pressure. Woodward puts you right there with these leaders as they face these insanely tough decisions, often without all the info they need and with the weight of the world on their shoulders.
It's easy to judge from afar, but war makes you feel that weight, the constant pressure they're under. It's not just about making the right choice, it's also about relationships, getting people on board and communicating clearly when everything's going crazy.
And it's so interesting to see how different personalities handle those challenges. Like you have Trump relying on instinct, making decisions from the gut, and using a very transactional approach to diplomacy.
And Biden, on the other hand, is more thoughtful, gathering information, talking to experts, and working through those traditional diplomatic channels.
Exactly. And in war, you see how those different styles play out on the world stage, how they affect alliances, and how they ultimately shape what happens.
Something else that struck me was the importance of intelligence, not just gathering it, but understanding it, interpreting it correctly, and then actually having the guts to act on it.
Oh, yeah. War is full of examples where intelligence, good or bad, becomes a turning point. We see how having accurate intel about Putin's plans helped the Biden administration get ready for the Ukraine invasion, even though they couldn't stop it.
And then there's the opposite, where Israel didn't act on the intel they had about the Hamas attack, and the results were devastating.
It's a harsh reminder that even the best intelligence agencies can get things wrong, and being able to evaluate information, cut through the noise, and make tough calls based on that, well, it's crucial.
Woodward also shows us the ethical dilemmas these leaders face, especially during war. There are no easy answers, and every decision feels heavy, morally.
You see that with Biden struggling over sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. He knows they can hurt civilians, but he also believes they're needed to help Ukraine defend itself. A truly tough choice. No good options.
And the situation with humanitarian aid in Gaza. Blinken wants Israel to let aid in, but Netanyahu's against it, saying it'll only help Hamas. How do you balance those competing needs, that ethical gray area?
It's rough. No easy solutions. You have to weigh the potential good and bad outcomes, try to minimize harm, and ultimately make the least bad decision in a situation where everything has downsides.
War doesn't give us simple answers, but it makes us think about those complicated questions, understand the trade-offs, and appreciate the heavy burden these leaders carry.
Woodward has covered so many presidencies and global crises, so he brings this amazing historical perspective to everything.
He's able to connect what happened in the past to the challenges we face today, showing how history shapes decisions and how the choices we make now will affect the future.
It reminds us that these challenges aren't new. Leaders have faced similar stuff for generations. There are lessons to be learned from looking back, from understanding how those who came before us dealt with these tough situations.
In a world where the news cycle is constant, with everyone shouting and giving instant analysis, that historical perspective is so important. It lets us take a step back, see the big picture, and understand how things play out over time.
War shows us that the decisions made by leaders, whether in Washington, Moscow, Jerusalem, or Kyiv, have real consequences. And often it's everyday people who feel those consequences the most.
It challenges us to think critically, question our assumptions, and engage with this complex, ever-changing world.
It's not just about powerful people and big events, it's about what it means to be human, our ability to do both amazing and terrible things, and the choices we make that shape our future.
Well said. And for everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into war has sparked your curiosity to learn more about these issues. It's a book that stays with you, and it reminds us that in a world as challenging as ours, informed and engaged citizens are more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Stay curious, keep learning, and remember, even when things are tough, there's always hope for a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.